On the same day that the Mets were hit with their first starting pitching injury of the spring, something that will impact their depth going into the early stages of this regular season, we were also reminded here in West Palm Beach that this club is inching closer and closer to beginning the regular season with a six-man rotation. We heard from ace Freddy Peralta, who pitched against the Astros here in West Palm Beach after his start, about whether he'd be comfortable in a six-man and what that would look like for him, something that he's experienced previously in his career with the Brewers. But before we get into that, let's go back to the injury news with Justin Hagenman, who was a depth piece for the Mets. He pitched a little bit last year with the big league club, was likely ticketed to be in AAA for the bulk of this season, barring some sort of barrage of injuries. He has a rib fracture. So he went on the 60-day injured list. That, of course, opened up a spot on the 40-man roster. The Mets promptly brought Richard Lovelady back. But, of course, losing Hagenman is a big deal. You can never have enough pitching. If you look at how many pitchers started a game for the Mets last year, they need a lot more than 5, 6, 7. They need double-digit, pitchers who are capable of making starts at the big league level, and Hagenman is on that list. So when we spoke to Mets manager Carlos Mendoza, this was earlier back in Port St. Lucie when the news was revealed, he said that they are going to miss Hagenman and that this is a big blow, someone who can make starts, can pitch multiple innings out of the bullpen, but that the Mets are comfortable with the depth that they still have internally. And if I were going to guess which three names he would bring up, it was the three names that he did. It's Christian Scott, Jonah Tong, and Tobias Myers. Myers, of course, is going to make the team. He's going to pitch in the bullpen unless the Mets are hit with a wave of injuries in the next week and a half before the regular season begins. But he had started previously in his career with the Brewers. He also came over in that Peralta trade. Expect him to be pitching in a multi-inning role, but he's a hybrid. He could make a spot start, could fill in on a full-time basis in the rotation if the Mets need it, and he's stretching out as a starter right now as some insurance. And Tong and Scott have both pitched at the big league level before, but I think they'll benefit from some time in AAA. Of course, Tong has already been optioned down there, but we saw him at big league camp earlier this spring. That depth is going to be tested early and often this year, so losing Hagenman is not ideal. And for the Mets, they hope that this doesn't lead to some sort of wave of injuries, as I alluded to earlier. From injuries to health, you look at that starting rotation, and as we've been talking about throughout the offseason, particularly once the Mets brought Peralta in, this club is overflowing with healthy big league starters. There's Peralta, Nolan McLean, Clay Holmes, Kodai Senga, David Peterson, and Sean Manaea. Manaea we talked about just a couple of days ago when in his last start he had a dip in his velocity. You'd think that would be a concern, a red flag, possibly more going on there after the injury-riddled season and the disappointing year that he had last year, but the Mets aren't concerned. At least that's what we're hearing now, something to keep an eye on. But with a week and a half, just under 2 weeks to go until opening day, all 6 of those starters are considered healthy and ready to go. And I think that, it's not like they're going to option McLean down. I would highly doubt that they would suddenly cut one of those veterans with how much money they're making and how important they are. So it seems like either they're going to go in with a 6-man or they'll have the standard 5-man rotation and move someone to the bullpen. When we spoke to Mendoza after the Mets lost to the Astros here in West Palm Beach, and this was after we had already talked to Peralta, more on that in a second, he said that they haven't made up their minds yet. It's going to depend on how things go over the next week and a half, how the schedule unfolds to begin the year. You look at the off days, you look at how the Mets formulate their bullpen. But the good news here is that Peralta is seemingly pretty comfortable, and the vibe that I got hearing him talk about this 6-man rotation possibility today on Saturday was that he's putting the team first, that this is something that he's comfortable with. He just wants to win. I'll read you some of the quotes from him. He said, "No problem. As long as there's communication, which things have been great with the Mets so far," which reminds me of what he talked about with the potential of an extension, that he's been loving this experience with the Mets to this point. And again, it's something that he's done before. He can manage that. But my 2 biggest takeaways with the possibility of a 6-man rotation are pretty simple. On the one hand, this might be a good thing to have McLean, for instance, not throw as many innings early on. You give him a couple extra days of rest between starts. That's going to help with his longevity, and you got to keep him sharp and ready to go. If this team is going to pursue a championship later this fall, you got to have someone like that, pitching at the top of his game, and this is going to be his first full season at the big league level. But on the other side, the Mets gave up a lot to get Freddy Peralta, and unless they extend him over the next couple of weeks before the season begins or during this year, he's going to enter free agency at the end of the season. So you give up Jet Williams, you give up Brandon Sproat, two of your top-ranked prospects. You want Peralta to pitch as much as possible, and he certainly gives the Mets the best chance to win. And in terms of how he did on Saturday against the Astros, 4 innings, 1 hit, 1 run allowed, 1 walk, and 5 strikeouts. He had 11 whiffs. There's a little bit of a dip in his velocity too, but this is not something he's concerned about. He was saying he wasn't even looking at those numbers, that he knows that when the intensity of the regular season begins, that'll ramp up naturally. He threw 56 pitches in the game, but then jogged out to the bullpen and threw a little bit more. He ended up with 65 pitches total. When I asked him about the 11 whiffs and what that tells him about, how his stuff is holding up with maybe one and change or 2 Grapefruit League outings left before opening day, he said that it's a good sign and it's telling him that he is positioning himself well for when these games will really start to count.